when you look at the Strait of Hormuz, just so everybody understands what the situation there. People talk about cutting off oil supply, but all of the LNG produced in Qatar flows through the Strait of Hormuz to market. So if that passageway was shut off, then the LNG production would stop, and if the LNG production stops, the helium production stops.
Hello and welcome to the 1895 podcast with me, Tom.
And me, Rob. We thought we'd be bringing you podcasts about CO2 in the industry financials this month, but that's not the case because we have escalating military action in the Middle East region, and there are far-reaching implications across various energy and commodity markets. If you're just joining us, it is mid-afternoon on Monday, the 2nd of March. As I said, we've got escalating military action and conflict in the Middle East region and far-reaching consequences across various markets, pretty much every market we can think of, Tom. So perhaps you could take a couple of minutes to run us through what we know so far.
Yes, this has been a hectic last 48 hours, I think, in regards to the industrial gases industry and this quick-moving conflict and story that is going on in the Middle East. And I'm going to hone in a little on the Strait of Hormuz here, which is, of course, the passageway where around a quarter of the world's energy passes through, and particularly helium, which we'll get onto later. But firstly, this isn't a strait which is closed. If we're gonna be technical about it, Iran has only issued warnings, effectively halting or deterring transit through this strait. So major ship operators, including the containers and the tanker owners, they have suspended shipments of crude oil, of fuel, of LNG via the Hormuz Strait because of these safety concerns. And I think we have seen 3 tankers struck in the Strait of Hormuz at the time of recording. A lot of these vessels have turned around, have returned to port, they've dropped anchor, and you can follow the shipping data online and you can see it's just at a bit of a standstill around there. There's the odd tanker passing through here or there, but we understand that they're ships that are related to the Iranian regime or their allies or some Russian tankers as well, possibly passing through too. We've seen a lot of Japanese link carriers also halt their operations. Nippo Yusen, Mitsui, OSK and Kawasaki Kisen have instructed all their ships to suspend or delay any transit through the strait because of those security concerns and wait until that security improves. So that's created a huge reaction for energy prices and gas prices in the market. Brent crude prices have jumped massively, briefly topping around $80 per barrel, I think. And that's, day one after opening, after all this conflict over the last 48 hours. And European gas and LNG prices have also spiked. We've only just seen this around an hour or so ago here in the UK, but that's one that we'll be keeping an eye on for sure.
We certainly will. And we have to say, look, there's some terrible reports, terrible footage out there of how this is playing out. It does appear to be escalating. Our thoughts are with everybody involved in this situation. And as you said, there are the knock-on effects of that across various markets. I think we saw early analysis this morning, on Monday morning here in Europe, as you rightly said, showed that Brent crude had surged more than 8% in early Asian trade on the 2nd of March, briefly exceeding $82 per barrel before easing back. Petrochemical markets have reacted, with China's methanol futures rising more than 6% amid concerns over Iranian supply. Iran, of course, is the world's second largest methanol producer. By the afternoon, and just before we came on air to record this, more shockwaves have been rippling through the markets. Qatar Energy has suspended LNG production at the world's largest export facility following those military attacks. As a result, as you said, Tom, European gas prices have surged 48% since Friday. That's according to the ICIS front month benchmark, to be clear. We're also seeing that the same benchmark, its early day assessment for April 2026, stood at $13.94 per MMBTU, up 26% from the previous close, before climbing a further 20% in volatile trading after confirmation of that LNG production halt in Qatar. No LNG vessels have transited the Strait of Hormuz since Saturday, effectively cutting off around 20% of global LNG supply, we hear. So clearly a huge impact on LNG markets, and those gas prices, those wholesale gas prices, will be affected, as we're already seeing. As you rightly point out as well, no formal blockade. It's just that tankers remain anchored due to heightened security and insurance risks. And oil markets have reacted. Yeah, that Brent crude has risen now more than 10% at the time of going on air. So, very, very strained markets, Tom.
Absolutely is. And it is, as you referenced at the top of this conversation, it's one of those black swan events which we've definitely been speaking about these for the last couple of years. I feel like they've always been simmering in the background, but something like this, you can't predict when it's going to happen. You don't know that there's going to be a closure on the Strait of Hormuz, or that LNG tankers are going to be attacked by Iranian missiles. You just can't predict that. But
that's like the very nature of the black swan event. That's why we call it that. It's why we've been talking about it. We assessed that in a GWGI Risk Watch report in Q1 last year, what potential of the black swan, and we talked about it a lot at our Helium Summit, didn't we?
We absolutely did. And in that Risk Watch, you allocated the helium market at a risk score of around 3 because of these black swan events, because
3 out of 5, yeah.
Just can't predict it. You don't know whether you're here or there.
Yeah, the market's pretty stable. It has been for a few years. We've talked about that a lot. But yeah, exactly that. You just do not know when something like this could occur, and very rapidly the kind of the widespread impact or consequences of that. And I think we've got a few clips to share, haven't we? Because just underscoring how vulnerable the helium market could be, and arguably is now, to such events. This is something our friend and the foremost global helium consultant Phil Cornblue talked about in 2023, I think, a fasten your seatbelts moment.
I've been in this business a long time. I've had to do annual budgets and 2-year forecasts and 5-year forecasts and things like that. And I would just say that it is a very difficult business to forecast going out beyond a couple of years, because there are so many variables. There are, the geopolitical factors. There are the unpredictable plant outages and things like that. So whatever I just said for the last hour, take it with a grain of salt, because I can make forecasts based on the known variables, but it's very hard to predict the black swans and the unknowns. And we could come back in 3 years or 5 years and say, geez, that guy didn't know what he was talking about. And I'd like to say I know what I'm talking about, but I'm not clairvoyant. So, things happen, things will continue to happen. And, I would say it's going to continue to be a very interesting business and a fun business. And, keep your seatbelt fastened.
Phil Cornblue there, like you say, back in 2023, and I'm sure that if I delve further back into the archive, we could find similar sentiment from even further back.
We could, and we could dive back into that archive and find a lot of conversations around the helium business and the need for a plan B, plan C, plan D, and I feel like we're potentially heading to those conversations again any day now. But again, yes, so black swans, Phil's also described recurring black swans before, hasn't he, Tom?
He has. He did this quite recently, actually, when we spoke earlier this year on a helium webinar. This was 3 or 4 weeks ago now, and the sentiment of that webinar was very much, we're in a period of calm. There's a plentiful supply, in fact, but as we've been saying, things can change really quickly. So let's listen back to what he had to
I think
say.
another of your guests on that webinar also described any black swan event could push helium into shortage, right?
Yes, that was Tom Elliott of Hotspur Helium. So perhaps we can dig out clips for the both of them.
I think and it's crucially, it's not just Iran, right? Or Qatar. It's any of the handful, frankly, of large helium suppliers out there. If any of those go down, and Phil refers to them as black swan events, if anything like that happens, then there is a real issue there for global supply. Look, I think it comes back to my point on regionalization of the market. US and Canada is putting itself in a very strong position when it comes to helium. They've got a lot of smaller companies that are producing helium. They've got the larger guys who are out there. They've got storage. They've still got the ability to import. So that's a really, as a market goes, that's looking pretty healthy. If you look into other areas, Europe is a good example for this. The number of routes for supply are very limited, and any event that happens, anything that changes that dramatically, becomes a real problem.
The second scenario that I consider possible is what I call recurring black swans. So with recurring black swans, the future looks a lot like the past. In the past, we have had periods where supply was plentiful, and then something happens and we're back in a tight market. So I think that's still possible. I can think of things that could go wrong that could put us back into a tight market or even a shortage.
Phil Kornbluth and Tom Elliott on that recent webinar, which can be viewed at gasworld.tv. And that leads quite nicely onto another upcoming Snap webinar that we're doing, doesn't it, Rob?
It does, yeah. We're going to be sitting down, Tom, aren't we, with Phil. We're going to talk about this whole situation and the expected impacts on the helium supply chain as a result of this military action on Wednesday, aren't we?
Yes, Wednesday at 2:30 UK time. So that will be definitely worth tuning in for, because this is such a fast-moving story. As we keep saying, this is moving every hour, isn't it? So what we're discussing now could be completely different on Wednesday.
It absolutely could. But what do we know now? Okay, so let's take a quick appraisal of where we think things are. We know that Qatar accounts for approximately 30% of the world's helium capacity, and over 80% of that output is produced as a byproduct of LNG production from its Helium-1 and Helium-2 facilities in Ras Laffan Industrial City. Now, we'd already suspected that there was going to be an impact on helium supply, disrupting the flow of helium from Qatar to European and Asian markets. And that was before we had the news a couple of hours ago about Qatar Energy pausing or stopping LNG and associated products production. So it does look as though we are heading towards an impact on the helium markets in Europe and Asia, and potentially globally if that supply is taken off the table. While helium containers are able to circumvent the Strait of Hormuz via overland routes to the Omani port of Salalah or the Saudi port of Jeddah, LNG tankers filled at Ras Laffan must pass through the strait to get to market. And as we just said, LNG production has also been paused in the first instance anyway. So I do think we have a potential problem here. How long this situation endures will be the bigger question right now.
And is that perhaps a surprise to you how quickly Qatar Energy has stopped that LNG production? Is that normally something that comes a bit later in a cycle like this?
I don't think it would be a surprise given the attacks that we're seeing across the region. Were it not for that, yes, I would have expected it to go on a little bit longer, perhaps. I think if you look at the relative glut in oil markets and commodity markets in recent times, it's perhaps a better time, if you can call it that, to be able to have a brief pause in production. But yeah, I think it's the sheer safety and logistical reasons, and probably some economics as well. It makes sense to stop it right now.
And we're also seeing some of the countries' energy targeted as well in these attacks, so that could further influence what we see going forward. But
It could. I think the big question, though, Tom, I think, is how long this goes on. Will this, for want of a better term, will it fizzle out over the next few days, or is this going to continue? I mean, Phil had already told us over the weekend that if shipments were disrupted for a few days or a week, this would not have a significant impact on helium markets beyond near-term inconvenience and increased transportation costs. But I think if this is sustained, and if we continue to see that LNG production down from Qatar as well, then it does look like we've got a problem.
And of course, it's only speculation, but from what we've heard from the world leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, then this could persist for some time. I believe there's also a link here between the hydrogen industry and Iranian output as well, isn't there, that our editor Charlie Curry has been looking at?
Yeah, so Charlie's looked at 3 reasons that the Gulf conflict matters for clean hydrogen. Let's be very clear, that's clean hydrogen. And he's talking about the shipping and insurance risk with oil prices jumping. Ship tracking data from marine traffic showed a 70% drop in vessel traffic through the Strait of Hormuz on the day of the attacks. He's also talking about fossil price changes, those gas prices we talked about, changing the competitiveness of clean hydrogen's pricing benchmark, which had always been very unfavourable, of course, against incumbent fossil fuels. So that could be good in some respects for clean hydrogen, but blue hydrogen is more exposed to those gas price increases. And his final point was the policy response and whether that could be a tailwind into hydrogen markets. Could it create a choke point whereby governments are pushed to accelerate renewables build out, grid investments and domestic clean fuels to prioritise lower import demand? And Charlie even writes, in a prolonged conflict scenario, energy security could displace cost optimization as the primary driver of fuel policy. So a bit of analysis there. Head to h2-view.com to read all of Charlie's insights.
And of course, gasworld.com is going to be the home of everything industrial gas related, everything helium, LNG related, and that will be being updated every couple of hours with a new take or a new angle or a new story or a new development right now.
A new development, exactly. And Charlie's writing there about clean hydrogen, but we mustn't forget there's a considerable refinery and sort of traditional grey hydrogen in Iran that we believe has been hit. We've also seen attacks on a Saudi refinery. So look, there's potential impacts here on sort of conventional hydrogen supply as well. And
as you said earlier, time will be the big teller here. We're going to get more details, we're going to get more analysis and more clarity as well of where this goes and what happens next. And like you say, it'll be great to get into that conversation on Wednesday with Phil to really pick his brains on where he thinks this could go.
Absolutely. I think we should bring the best of that webinar to our podcast listeners.
Yes, fantastic idea. Well,
so that looks like we're going to be in the studio quite a bit in the next week, Tom.
I think we could be, yeah. It's been a busy day today in the newsroom, hasn't it? And that's going to definitely continue for at least the next few days. So
I would expect so, yeah.
We'll be sure to keep listeners and readers of the 1895 podcast and Gasworld up to date, and we'll be back again next time.